Welcome to the USS Connecticut's final investigation report. Everything you're about to hear is from the declassified final investigation report that's been fully redacted by the United States Navy, and I'm here to share it with you today because it's quite a story. Let's go ahead and begin. So, if you're not aware, on the 2nd of October of 2021, the Connecticut struck an undersea bathymetric feature. That's kind of their way of saying something underwater that wasn't moving. Another way of saying that is the earth or the ground. A grounding occurred. Now, this mishap, according to the Navy, was preventable. The result of this was an accumulation of errors that we're going to talk about today, omissions, which are really important, and of course, overall performance from key people on board led to this bathymetric feature being run into. The Connecticut is available for operations for an extended period of time, including the time of this recording, even though it's been 7 or 8 months now. Long time. All right, let's go back to the beginning and talk about all the players involved, the key players involved. Obviously, the entire crew is involved. But at the very top, you have the commanding officer right there. He is responsible for the performance of his ship, the safety of his crew, and bringing the ship back undamaged. Also, things like not getting counter-detected and things like that are important in the submarine field. So he's responsible for all that. Underneath him is the executive officer, commonly spoken XO. Now, the XO in our story today will also be playing the part of the command duty officer. Command duty officer is somebody who, when this commanding officer is not on the con, doing his thing, the XO can go and make himself the command duty officer and kind of take on that role, giving the captain some reprieve. But know this, every officer of the deck that we're going to get into is a representative of the commanding officer's authority. So it's as if the CO is there, but it's just a different person holding them. The CDO is a position between those two. Alongside the XO, but on the enlisted side, is the chief of the boat, commonly spoken Cobb. And he's the senior enlisted advisor to the captain. And that's why I put him here next to the XO, because the XO is the senior officer advisor to the captain. And they often advise the captain together at the same time daily on what's going on with the crew and how things are going. So they both play very important roles. Below them are the department heads. These are the weapons officer, the navigator, and the engineer. Today's story will also have an operational safety officer and an operations officer that was temporarily assigned for this cruise, and we'll get into that. So below the department heads, the on-watch people that we need to know the names of are the ANAV and the quartermaster. When I say names, I just mean their titles. The names of everybody except the captain and the Cobb have been redacted for privacy, and we're not going to violate any of that today. We're just going to read from the report. Let's get started. We're going to start in July 2020. This grounding kind of began all the way back then, over a year before it actually happened. This is Submarine Training Facility, San Diego, California. A very important training facility on the West Coast. I spent a lot of time here myself. So what the crew is being trained on before they go on their underway is theater commander guidance, making sure that they're compliant with that. This is all happening in classrooms and in simulators, things like this. So this is a shore facility that the crew goes to get this training done. They also practice or they review recent own ship evaluations to see where they're weak and where they're strong, and they try to bring the weak points up. ComSub PAC for the Pacific Fleet also has guidance. They're trained on that. Core competencies, basic submarining, seamanship, communications, professionalism, that all is under that. Mission areas, where are they going to be operating? Where are the likely operating areas? Because at this time, they probably don't have a specific mission, so they're going to go over where they may be deployed and learn about oceanography, topography, depending on their jobs. That's going to be very important. Recent operations, they'll take a look at the Connecticut's previous deployments and see how they did. What was their most recent combat certification score, and where were those weak areas? What do they need to improve on? All that comes in. Also, the captain of the Connecticut can submit to the training facility things that he wants his crew to get better at. That's very important to them. So he does that. And then finally, deployment lessons learned. And this can be for the ship, it can be fleet-wide, and it kind of wraps it up. So this is a lot of training that happens before they even go back to the submarine and take it underway again. Okay, in July 2020, training begins. Or the training is ended, and the results are in. And here we have the squadron admiral formally counsels in writing the commanding officer. He sends a letter of performance into his record and gives it to him as well for inadequate supervisory oversight. He's noticing some problems with this USS Connecticut command. Ineffective accountability of practices. So if they even find a weakness, they don't necessarily address it. There's no accountability on the USS Connecticut according to the CSDS. Superficial self-assessments. In other words, whenever they do their own self-assessment, they write it up, they make sure the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, and then they file it away and never to be addressed again. And honestly, self-assessment is only one step in the process of getting better. You have to implement policies and changes and then act on those things to actually make improvements. Well, they're just doing a superficial self-assessment according to the squadron commander. So, on the 16th of February, 2021, we're going to fast forward into 2021. CSDS issues a letter of instruction because they still have not acted on his previous letter. So the CO is directed to address the crew's overall performance. He's saying there's a lack of improvement since the last time we talked. You haven't made the changes that I recommended 6 months ago. So here's a letter of instruction. This is a formal military letter that says thou shalt do X, Y, and Z. And finally, he says, this is because you're getting this letter because of your reluctance to accept feedback. And this is something that I've seen in the Navy going back decades, because I was in the Navy a long time ago at this point. There are some commands where they just don't accept the schoolhouse or the training facility's feedback as well as other commands do. And it's a little bit of confidence, which is good. You need confidence, but it's also a little bit of arrogance, and that's not as good. That can be, detrimental to everyone's performance, getting better. If you think you're already as good as anybody else is going to make you, there's no need to improve. And so the squadron commander is accusing this commanding officer of having that mentality. So he issues this letter of instruction in February 2021 to address those issues formally. Okay, and 14th of April 2021, while pulling alongside a pier in San Diego, California, they strike the pier. In nautical terms, it's called ALLIDED, or they allied with the pier. The only reason why it's not called a collision is a collision happens between two moving objects at sea. The pier is a static object, therefore it's not technically a collision, it's an alighting. An easier way to say it is they struck the pier. So they immediately went into a safety stand down, which is where you don't do any work on the ships. Work still has to be done, but you're not doing it today, and maybe not even tomorrow. Some safety stand downs can last a week, and that pushes all the work that was supposed to be done on that week to the next week, and the weekend as well, because it's got to get done, but you're not allowed to work at all. Everyone puts their tools down during a safety stand down. It's a real pain for the enlisted men, but it's important. They just hit a pier. So they're going to go over things like danger recognition, risk management for everybody. Everybody on board a submarine is trained in risk management rather. Formality, communications. Formality is really important on a submarine because you got to be able to say the same things the same way as people expect to hear them and not random or different every single time. Because whenever a casualty happens, you need that instinct to report things in the right order. And the person listening during the casualty, who has all this adrenaline running in their body, they need to be able to listen and expect the reports in the order that they expect to hear them. That way there's no miscommunication, or less likely to have miscommunication. Formality in communications, very important. And then basic watchstanding skills. And they also conduct a command investigation as to what happened whenever they were pulling alongside the pier. The result of this investigation is that the navigator from the USS Toledo at this time, which is in a dry dock maintenance availability, he's not going to sea and he's a navigator, right? He is assigned to the USS Connecticut, and he's going to be the ops officer. So he's ops in our story today. And his sole purpose is to assist them with these things, and he's an additional navigator. So maybe they won't run into something. So on the 18th of May, 2021, Comm Submarine Development Squadron 5, Allied evaluation comes out. This is them striking the pier. And he says striking the pier could have been prevented. His recommendation, this is like the commander of the squadron of the 3 submarines in CSDS-5. For a little bit of backstory, CSDS-5 is Seawolf, Connecticut, and Jimmy Carter, and that's it. They're the development squadron. if you if you want to join the Navy, get into a development squadron because they do the best missions. Okay, but CSDS-5 made up of 3 submarines, all Seawolf class. All right, he's saying, well, my commander on the USS Connecticut is having problems, and I recommend disciplinary action because he's already done a letter of instruction. He's already done, a letter of condemnation into his record. His next step is a disciplinary action, but this one is for everybody involved in the striking of the pier: the CO, the XO, the navigator, the officer of the deck at the time, which is not named, so I don't know who it is, and also the ANAV. They're all going to get disciplinary if his recommendation is followed and approved by higher ups. The charge is dereliction of duty. That's a UCMJ violation. That's pretty significant. That's like Article 92 stuff. That's a big one in the Navy terms. Okay, on the 19th, the very next day, he informs ComSub PAC, that's the submarine admiral for all Pacific Fleet, okay, under which he's under, and also Commander Task Force 74. You want to remember these names because these guys are really involved in what happens next. So Commander Task Force 74, he's overstationed in Japan, and then ComSub PAC, he's responsible for the entire submarine force of the Pacific Fleet. Okay. All right, so the next day, the 20th of May, our hard-nosed commander of Commander Submarine Squadron, Development Squadron 5, has a sudden reversal after talking to ComSub PAC and CTF 74. He comes back, and I have to quote this. I can't paraphrase this. He comes back after writing a letter of an instruction, condemnation, and recommending disciplinary action to the very next day writing this. This is a recommendation for the USS Connecticut. He says, while this investigation of striking the pier revealed degrading standards in navigation planning, poor seamanship, and an ineffective command and control, it represented an anomalous performance and not a systematic failure. Quote, I observed a safe landing from the bridge of the USS Connecticut on the 13th of May, 2021, indicating that the appropriate reflection and training of the crew with completion of the Pre-Overseas Movement Eval, POM Eval, on 14 May 2021. I certified the safe navigation of the ship through all phases of submarine operation. So after almost a year of condemnation of saying you're not taking the right steps, you're not improving, they hit up here, there's things going wrong on this command. And the only guy who's saying anything formally about this, addressing this issue, is suddenly on board with it. They pull into San Diego one time without hitting the pier, and he's like, well, we're good to go, I guess. So what happened? What happened in that conversation between him and ComSub PAC, him and CTF 74 over in Japan? What was said on that Zoom call? Well, something that changed this man's mind. That's what was said. And he was relieved. The one guy saying that, hey, the Connecticut, not a good command right now, they're not able to navigate safely, gets relieved. Now, I'm not sure if this was a scheduled relief or if this was a disciplinary relief. That is not outlined in the investigation. So I'm going to say that this was a scheduled change of command, and this was his last day at work, and that's why he wrote this report. Anyway, so he's out of the picture. He's like, not my problem anymore. See ya. So ComSub PAC steps in because the incoming commanding officer has to get his feet under him, right? He's not ready to take on all this drama. So ComSub PAC says, listen, I certify the USS Connecticut for deployment. He formally counsels the COXO NAV WEPs, officer of the deck, and the ANAV. Okay, so that's another piece of paper in the record. These guys at this point have more counseling sheets than a seaman after a liberty call in a foreign port. And he says there will be a mid-deployment check ride to ensure improvement. This is the one really good decision that I think ComSub PAC makes at this point. He says you're about to go on a 6-month or greater mission, in the Western Pacific. Somewhere between month 2 and month 4, we're going to do an inspection and make sure everything's okay. So that's a good idea. It's not all bad news at this point. Okay, so let's fast forward to the 26th of May, 2021. The USS Connecticut has pre-underway checks complete. At this point, the forward bottom sounder is fully operational. Okay, and that becomes important later on. On the 27th of May, it deploys ahead of schedule. And on the 24th of June, almost a month later, ComSub PAC makes the final endorsement on the striking of the pier investigation, saying that's behind us. You guys are, cleared for deployment, and off they go. Again, that didn't happen until June. Okay, so the mid-deployment check ride does happen. They get on, they do fire drills, they, interview the crew, they inspect the service records, the medical records, make sure all the paperwork and administration is good. And then they also run some weapons drills and navigation drills. Navigation drills include red and yellow soundings, or indications that you're not transiting safely. There's all sorts of things that they can simulate. In this case, according to the investigation, among all the other things they did, they also simulated red and yellow soundings, which, without going into any detail, because I don't know how much I can talk about it, is they're simulating the bottom being more shallow than expected. And I won't go into any more detail than that, but that's what the red and yellow soundings in general mean. Okay, the crew did not investigate during the inspection. With the inspectors on board watching over their shoulder, they got the red and yellow sounding. They recognized the red and yellow sounding. They called it away, but then they didn't investigate why. I guess, it's a little bit of, whenever you're in a drill and you see the real indication is fine, but then you have the drill monitor handing you a piece of paper showing you what is supposed to be the indication so the drill can happen. Well, they acknowledged the piece of paper essentially and then just left it at that. And the reason why that's a little funny is there's required actions that happens with a yellow sounding, and then another set of actions that happens with a red sounding. And they're very important actions. They didn't do any of that stuff. So I'm sure the drill monitors were furiously taking notes saying these guys do not understand how to respond to these navigational drills. Okay, and I think the evidence will show that they were right. All right, so no additional crew deficiencies other than this navigational hiccup where they just didn't respond to the red and yellow soundings, which blows my mind as a sailor. So the forward bottom sounder at this point, at the midpoint of their deployment during this inspection, is not working again. So they're having problems with that forward sounder. The bottom sounder is very important because that tells you how much depth you have between the keel and the bottom of the ocean. And they have two of these sounders, one forward, one aft, separated by the length of the boat, right? So they just use the aft sounder and everything's fine, right? It's not a big deal. It's a noted, mechanical failure. They're going to get it fixed whenever they pull into port. All the communications to get the part into Guam whenever they eventually pull in, whenever that is, will be there on the pier ready and waiting, and they'll just get it repaired. So, and that's all documented. That's fine. The point is they're using the second of two sounders. They're down to one. So they don't want that one to fail, right? They're just using that aft one. All right, so let's move on to the day of the event, okay? So this is 2300 Zulu, I guess because it's right before midnight, technically the day before the event, by 30 minutes. Now, I need to explain real quick Zulu time. Submarines, whenever they go to sea, they go off their local time, whether it's, West Coast time, East Coast time, doesn't matter, and they go to Zulu time. So Zulu time is based on GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. Today, I believe it's known as UTC, Universal Time Code, whatever the C means. Anyway, so it's that. So they're in the Pacific with a time code that on the surface is based out of London, right? So don't confuse just because it's 11:30 watch time in the middle of the quote night for the submarine that's submerged with no sense of day or night. Topside, it's a different time totally, okay? And that's not even an important point to understand. Just know that as far as we're concerned, it's 11:30 at night, okay? And it's been that way for months because we're going into month whatever of this deployment. Okay, the XO is the CDO on the con. Remember, I told you when the captain's not there, the XO can and often does assign himself as command duty officer alongside the officer of the deck, who is the engineer. This watch section's name, there's 3 watch sections that rotate. This is watch section harder. Okay, that's the name that they gave themselves, and they're the harder watch section. Okay, so it's 01:15 in the morning. They're cruising along submerged. Everything's, happy. The quartermaster, he's taking his soundings as he's required. The one at 01:15, he doesn't get a return. And he's not allowed to change modes because they're, they're in a deployment lineup, basically. So, he just does it again and again and again. He's not getting a return. He's like, So he goes back to his navigational log. Quartermaster has their own log, a ship's log, a very important log. And he logs, hey, no sounding. The aft bottom sounder operation is degraded above 16 knots. This note is in the inspection, implying that they're doing something above 16 knots at this point. So we're going to assume that, okay? They're doing some speed above 16 knots, and he notes in the log, unable to get sounding due to speed above 16 knots. Okay, the quartermaster did not take required actions for loss of sounding, including informing the officer of the deck. He was like, no sounding, make a note in the log, back to doing quartermaster things. That's an egregious violation. If you have a secret, you don't want to be the guy holding it. You want to share that information with everybody, especially the officer of the deck. He's the guy that needs to know that we don't know how much water we have below us, starting at 01:15 in the morning, okay? All right, so at 01:45, 30 minutes later, he attempts to make another sounding. The sounding fails. He makes a note in the log. Oh no, this time he doesn't make any note in the log. He just, no action. So the ship's log needs to have the sounding, if they don't have a separate log for it, in the ship's log, you know. At the very least, there should be a fathometer log that has it. And they don't. He just doesn't write it down anywhere. He does it again at 0200 in the morning. Takes a sounding, no return. Does nothing, tells no one. I don't know what this quartermaster is thinking at this point, but he's really letting down the safety of everybody on board at this point. All right, at 03:23 in the morning, this is in the ship's log, the XO says, I secure myself as the command duty officer. The officer of the deck has the helm in the con, and he secures himself and goes off to the wreck because it's in the middle of the morning, right? He's got a whole workday ahead of him. The XO, by the way, along with the captain to an extent, but the XO especially, one of the hardest working people on board in terms of lack of sleep. They are by far awake the longest, him and maybe even the Cobb, but depending on the boat you're on. But the XOs that I've always worked with, they seem to always be up. And even if they're in their stateroom, they're working on administration duties and stuff like that. And so I'm sure this guy's really tired at this time, 3 o'clock in the morning. He's going to go lay down for an hour or two so he can get up and start a whole new workday again. All right. But also the XO, who's the CDO or was not aware of the lack of soundings now for an hour and a half, 2 hours and a half. Anyway, almost 2 hours, right? A long time. So let's talk about voyage management real quick. Okay, the chart was not properly marked. We're going to start with the things that are wrong with the chart. There's something called the VMS, that's Voyage Management System, and the chart is not properly marked with underwater danger and hazard marks as it's supposed to be. So the investigation found out that there was at least 5 navigational hazards that were not marked along the sub's current path. Okay, so the submarine's going to go through 5 navigational hazard zones, not 1 or 2, but 5 of them, and it's not even marked on the map. Now the chart, the reason why you know it's a hazard zone is the chart comes with these danger hazard zones marked on it already, but it is the responsibility of the ANAV and the quartermaster to do an overlay in VMS that outlines it, okay, and they did not do that. That's what the investigation's saying. Okay, should have been marked as stay out, and the other areas marked as stay out. So you have hazard areas and navigation hazards. They both need to be marked as stay out. The OD did not report these nav hazards to the commanding officer. Now, the commanding officer who approved the chart and the voyage plan probably knew about it. And I believe in his second interview to the investigative team, he did say that he was aware of these hazards and he expected his watch teams to navigate around them. That's putting a lot of responsibility on your officer of the deck, your ANAV, and your quartermaster. And, they could probably safely, in good circumstances, do that. But we have a quartermaster that's not had a sounding in a couple hours and he's not telling anybody. And we have a chart that's not properly overlaid and marked. And we have a captain that's like, you guys take care of it. He didn't even say that, but that was his approach to this situation. So you can see how these things can go wrong quick, right? So at 0424, the ANAV directs the quartermaster to remove stay out from overlays. So there were some areas on this chart that did have the overlay on that had, hey, stay out of this area. Okay. But there were still 5 that did not, that were supposed to, that did not have that. But no one knows why the ANAV made this decision. Why would you ever move a stay out area overlay? The quartermaster, because he was ordered to do it, he just did it. And later on when he was interviewed, he didn't know why he did it. He just knew that he was told to remove these overlays. Anyway, so we have an ANAV and a quartermaster acting strangely, and certainly in the quartermaster's case, not in accordance with standard submarine operating, procedures. And the most important thing is the watch section used a temporary route instead of updating an approved nav plan. And in the final, investigation, summary, they pointed this out as being the primary reason, or among all the primary reasons, this is the most, one that influenced the collision, is that the quartermaster, working presumably with the ANAV and maybe not even informing the officer of the deck, was plotting a temporary route off the course that was the approved route on the chart from the commanding officer without telling the commanding officer. We know for sure the captain did not know this. But then again, the captain told the investigators he expects his navigation team to navigate the submarine around navigational hazards marked on the chart. So, but that is not in accordance with the SOM, that's for sure. Submarine Operating Manual. All right, okay, 0500. The XO's only had like 90 minutes of sleep at this point, but everybody's getting up and they're going to do their daily operations brief. It is the 2nd of October, 2001. This is the day of the event, 0500. Everybody's in the wardroom. You got the captain, the XO, chief of the boat, navigator, ops. That's the navigator from the Tulsa. We have the operations safety officer, who's another officer on board the boat. He's responsible for safety, for the entire command. The ANAV and the ACCENT sonar rider is there too. And they're going to do a daily brief of what they expect to happen today. For whatever reason, and we don't know, it's not said in the investigation report, the CO, whenever the safety brief is supposed to begin, he says to the safety officer that today's briefing is not required nor desired. So there is no brief. Nobody says anything. We don't know when the last sounding was reported to the officer of the deck. We know that we have a couple hours of no soundings. Nobody knows the true depth between the keel and the bottom of the submarine at this time. Certainly not the captain. No one's reported anything to him yet. And that's because there's a lack of communication between the quartermaster, who's operating the fathometer without success, and the officer of the deck. It's not going past that point. All right, so the briefing is adjourned without update. This is normally when breakfast is served, so we assume breakfast at this time. No one is aware of the loss of sounding from 115, like I said. And the ANAV did remove the overlays from the VMS and didn't tell anybody. So the navigation team is kind of operating by themselves, and things are not going right, and they're not telling anybody. 30 minutes later, watch section trigger comes on board. So this is the normal rotation, I guess. At 040 Zulu, the quartermaster reports to the OD, sounding does not check with chart. So since this is a new watch section, it's probably, a new quartermaster for sure. The ANAV would always be the ANAV. The ANAV is a position on board, not a rotation. So the ANAV is still the same guy. But the new quartermaster says, hey, we don't have soundings. And then he goes back and he looks at the history and he's like, we haven't had a sounding for over 30 minutes as of 540 Zulu. So the officer of the deck and the quartermaster acknowledge that there's no sounding for 30 minutes, and then they don't tell anybody. This new watch section takes no action. And if you go back to when they had the mid-deployment inspection, that's the same thing that they did, is they acknowledged the yellow and the red soundings that were unexpected and they acknowledged them and took no action. If you go back to their pre-deployment training, back to whenever CSDS-5 was saying, hey, you guys don't respond to feedback and you don't correct yourself and you don't investigate red soundings. Going all the way back to pre-deployment training, they weren't doing that. And whenever it actually happens at sea, guess what? They take no action other than acknowledging the unexpected, or in this case, lack of soundings for 30 minutes at this point. All right, so the commanding officer is unaware of a nearby navigational hazard that is now not marked on the overlay anymore because the ANAV took it off, and is getting unexpected soundings or lack of soundings. Whenever they do get a sounding, it doesn't check with chart. That's really important. That means you're not where you think you are. Okay, the 0616 nav, the ANAV recommends changing transmission modes on the fathometer, and I'm not going to go into why that's important. Just know that they can't do that without the captain's permission. But there was like a temporary standing order in this case that said that they could do it without getting captain's permission. So I guess that's, there was an exception where they didn't need the commanding officer's permission to do this, but they were waiting to get commanding officer's permission to change transmission modes to see if they could get a better return, one that checks with chart, And so at 0618, 2 minutes later, sonar announces there is a broad and diffuse trace off the bow. It sounds like biologics, but what it really is its own ship's noise reflecting off a bathymetric feature right in front of them, and they run into it at greater than 16 knots. So the investigative report makes a comment that the sounder was not functioning, should have functioned properly up to 24 knots. So out of the investigation, we could assume that they were operating somewhere between greater than 16 knots and maybe 24 knots, but we really don't know. And that's not important. Just know that they weren't going slow whenever this collision happened at 0618 Zulu. You know, all right, so some immediate actions happened. The helm, as you see here, pulls full rise on the stern planes. The officer of the deck who is injured in the collision, he's bounced all around, orders, from his prone position to make depth 160 feet. The diving officer of the watch, in amidst all the commotion and noise and shock, for whatever reason doesn't hear that, but he's on board with going to the surface. Sonar reports degradation off the bow sonar. Sonar essentially at this point is blind with that one sensor. And there's also a loss of indication of speed because whenever they ran aground, they ripped off the speed indicator. So at 0619, USS Connecticut's going to the surface, boys. The diving officer of the watch has so much momentum because of the speed and the full rise on the stern planes, he can't help but breach and broach the surface now. So he announces the ship is going to the surface. Ship is often used for the word sub, for those of you that don't know. We just call everything ships whenever you're making formal, comms like this. You don't differentiate the two. Okay, so the diving officer of the watch grabs the controls, but the bow planes are stowed for high speed. So they don't have the bow planes extended. Therefore, the only planes they have are the stern planes, and the helmsman's already reaching back on those like his life depends on it, because it does. The chief of the watch, initial reaction is to sound the collision alarm. So he's right on. He's doing what he's supposed to do. And he stands by the emergency blow. So he's got his hands on the chicken switches, and then he just waits for the order to actually activate them. Because once you do that, you're going to the roof. Yeah, there's no stopping that. Okay, so sonar and fire control are aligned for periscope depth. So the weapons team is doing what they're supposed to do. Everybody's in a little bit of shock, but that training is kicking in, and they're just doing their automatic immediate actions as their brain catches up and digests what's going on. Okay, the officer of the deck orders all stop in an attempt to prevent broaching, because it's the speed at which they're going that's just driving them to the surface at this point. The captain enters control from his stateroom, which is right there, and announces, he grabs the 1MC and says, collision or an Allison or a lesion. In other words, they struck something, underwater. But the submarine broaches the surface anyway. 0620 Zulu, and for the next 3 minutes, they suffer negative buoyancy. That's a very nice way of saying they're sinking. So they do get to the surface. While they're on the surface, the WEPS, who's in control now, raises the number 2 scope for a look around. They obtain a GPS fix, and they realize that they're 1,200 yards northwest of their track of where they think they are. They're way off course. Being off course by, less than that is still a lot, okay? I'm not going to go into specifics, I guess, but there you go. That is a long way to be off course. Okay, so the chief of the watch attempts to pump overboard because they're negatively buoyant after the collision, and the trim pumps, for whatever reason, they aren't working properly. He checks his lineup, and the investigation confirmed his lineup was proper, but yet they can't pump water overboard. So something with the trim system is damaged, apparently. They can't get water off. So now the speed drops below 0 on the surface because they had ordered all stop. So they're on the surface, negatively buoyant, no speed. What is the only thing that happens? Well, you sink, and they begin sinking out. They're no longer at periscope depth. Periscope is underwater. They are sinking out. Okay, so they recommend all ahead standard to maintain depth. They're going to use the ship's speed to push the bow of the submarine up to the surface and try to maintain, a surface-like position where they can at least, not sink while they get things sorted out. Because the OD is injured and the WEPS is on the con, he announces that he has the con, and the captain is also there. I guess the captain would technically have the con since he's there. But unless the captain announced that, the weapons officer, he took over the officer of the deck position. Let's put it that way, because the other guy's hurt. Okay, 0624, they have lost propulsion and a loss of depth control at this point. So they're sinking past 70 feet because they had ordered the all stop. They're getting speed back on, though. They're trying to get that. The CO, who's on the con now, orders that chief of the watch with the chicken switches. He says, emergency blow all main ballast tanks. And that's what happens there. They start blowing high pressure air into the ballast tanks. The engine room reports loss of propulsion lube oil, which is huge because now you're limited in your propulsion. You need to have speed to maintain depth so you don't sink because we can't pump off water. And now there is a problem with the propulsion. We won't speculate what it was because it's not in the report. Okay, so chief of the watch, flood made ballast tanks with high pressure air because of that emergency blow, and depth continues to increase despite that. So they've done the emergency blow and they've slowed their descent, but they're still sinking slower down to 74 feet as recorded by the investigation. Okay, so PLO restored. The reason for the PLO rupture call from the engine room was because there was cooking oil stowed back there properly, but because of the collision, it got bounced all around, and these big 5-gallon drums of cooking oil spewed oil everywhere, which is still a big problem because that's a flammable liquid in an engine room with a lot of hot things. But the watchstanders back there, covered in this oil, thought that it was propulsion lube oil, which is means that the gears and everything's not being cooled. You can't do a lot back in the engine room without this PLO oil. All right, so the engine reports, hey, propulsion lube oil restored. They don't bother explaining what happened. It's just a report. We've got propulsion back. This is great news. So they get that bell, that all-ahead standard, back on to push the submarine that's sinking from 74 feet back up to the surface, nose high at about a 30-degree angle, nose up. And it's just going to, go along like that until they sort out the trim situation. All right. So the officer of the deck orders the chief of the watch to prepare a low pressure blow on all main ballast tanks. That's very different than a emergency blow. And I'm not going to go into that because it's not in the report. And I'd love to tell you about it, but I don't think I'm allowed to. Okay. 0628, the USS Connecticut is on the surface. She's held there with speed for the moment. She's still negatively buoyant, so she's got that up angle. And they raise the high data rate mast, which is one of the radio masts, and they get onto comm so they can make the report of what's going on, but they haven't done that yet. They've just got the mast up. At 0630, 2 minutes later, the trim system is restored. And according to the report, he solved the trim system in a very interesting way. They had 2 vented tanks that were open to the interior pressure. And by pumping from one tank to another, that cleared whatever was keeping the trim system from operating properly. It doesn't go into any more detail than that. And I know a lot about the trim system. I can't imagine what was messing it up, and I'm not allowed to speculate at this point. So we just have to know that according to the investigation, by pumping from tank to tank, that cleared up the trim system's ability to pump overboard. So they can now do that, and they begin deballasting as many tanks as they can. The report says up to 100,000 pounds of water overboard. And that doesn't happen quick, by the way, so this takes some time. So as that's going on, 10 minutes later at 0640, they do a voice report to CTF 74 in Japan, OPREP, ComSub LANT, or PAC rather, too, giving them just a voice report, that there's been an incident. We're investigating. We're trying to maintain, ship's damaged, crew injured, whatever the report is. That OPREP 3 is a quick report, and it's required that you have a follow-up report as soon as possible. But that at least lets everybody know, hey, something happened. You don't need to go back to your stateroom and write up a formal report that takes 20, 30 minutes, send it to the radio room to then tell the Admiralty an hour after the incident that something happened. This allows them to get on the bat phone right away and say, hey, Commander, we've had an incident. We're going to let you know what happened in a minute, but just know something's up. That gets everyone's attention. Everyone's ears are now, what's happened to the USS Connecticut? At 0741, they're finally able to put a low pressure blow on all main ballast tank, and that commences. And that's really important for survivability of the ship. Until the machinery room catches on fire. Yeah. In less than an hour, they've had a collision, loss of buoyancy, loss of ship's control and sinking, a engineering casualty, loss of propulsion lube oil, which ended up not being real, but it limited speed for a little bit while they thought it was real. And now they have a very real fire in the machinery room. We are so lucky we didn't lose the submarine. Oh my God. Okay, so what happened here was the number 2 trim pump was already in a reduced status. Every time they operated it, there was a mechanical deficiency, is what the report says. Who knows? And there's a temporary standing order that if they have to ever operate this trim pump, the number 2 one, that the watchstander will watch it closely because it tends to not work and do things. Well, the thing that it did after 40 minutes of continuous operation was catch on fire for reals. And so they called away fire and AMR. As soon as they isolated the electrical bus to the number 2 trim pump, the fire self-extinguished at that point because it was electricity feeding the flame at that point. And so once they did that, they isolated the fire, and all is better. But now everybody's in their flash gear trying to save the submarine. Just one thing after another. And this is how casualties happen. Casualties are very rarely isolated incidents. They cascade. This casualty, this collision, cascaded all over the boat, from the sonar being destroyed forward, to the engine room believing they had lost propulsion, to the machinery room catching on fire. Everybody's having a bad time all of a sudden because casualties will cascade. And that's what's happening here. Immediate actions of this crew is outstanding and probably is what saved the ship. Because whenever they were losing buoyancy, sinking past 74 feet without propulsion, they were screwed. That is a dying submarine. Whenever you do the emergency blow and you still have negative buoyancy and you don't have propulsion, well, guess what? You know, you better start making plans for the next life because you're almost done with this one. All right, so the CO orders a continuous low pressure blow on all main ballast tanks now that we're back on the surface and the fire is extinguished. The officer of the deck switches his watch to the bridge where he can do a visual assessment of everything that's going on, and they finally get a formal, you know, their version of events that happened up to this point off to CTF 40 or 74 rather. And remember, that's the command in Japan. They order them to go to Guam because that's the nearest friendly port that has repair facilities. And that's where they go. They arrive there a little less than a week later at on the 8th of October. They moor in Guam. And that is a breakdown of everything that happened during the collision. Okay. It's quite the adventure for these. And people were, you know, hurt. None of these injuries were life-threatening, but you had 11 injured sailors, completely lost your bow sonar, and, you know, array. It's degraded, but, I mean, come on, you smashed it. And there's also 7 additional sailors that they assessed over the 5 or 6 days it took to get to Guam that they needed additional mental health treatment. And I don't blame them. If I had experienced anything like this, I'd probably need some too. So, you know, it's good that they, at least the Navy, identified that, and these sailors are going to get the help that they need, because this is a traumatic, you know, situation that they just went through. So whenever they pulled into Guam, the divers went down to do a hull integrity check. And one of the things that they found in main ballast tank 1 Alpha 1 Bravo, that's the very forward ballast tank right behind the sonar sphere there, or large bow array, whatever they call it. Now it's different now than it used to be. There's like gravel and sand in the main ballast tank, meaning they plowed like a bulldozer right into the bottom, or right into a bathymetric feature, you know, that they call it here. Okay, this could have resulted in the loss of life and almost resulted in the loss of the sub. And if it wasn't for the immediate actions of the crew that are drilled into them, you know, dozens and dozens of times every year, if it wasn't for those immediate actions, we might have lost the submarine. But thankfully, enough people did the right thing, and enough systems worked just in time to save the submarine and the lives of everyone on board. All right, so let's talk about what the Navy think the causes were. This is not my opinion. This is from the investigation. And one of the key phrases in the summary is they do what's called peak to perform. And that means you're only performing at your best, which should be every day on a submarine, when you're being inspected. And looking at the inspection reports that's in this investigation, when they didn't react to things like a yellow and red sounding, didn't investigate those things, then they're not performing very well even at their peak in terms of navigation. Again, navigation is just one small slice of the entire submarine's operations, and it appears everybody else was doing what they're supposed to be doing. All right, so command performed at its highest ability during inspections, but did not maintain that standard day to day. That's from the investigation. They also said failure to meet safe navigation standards, failure to properly mark at least 10 charted hazards, so there ended up being more than 5 after the investigation looked at it, use of a temporary route instead of updating the nav plan, and we talked about that. The CO like I said, did not expect them to update the nav plan every time they wanted to change or get off the path. And that was the CO's call. But it resulted in this, was a major contributor to this happening. The navigation team did not understand where they were, that they were in restricted waters, because they had gone through some of those restricted areas. And because they didn't have an accurate sounding, they didn't realize how much in peril the ship was, as the bottom was coming shallower and shallower over at least an hour's time, if not longer, that they were not aware of their impending grounding. Okay, the ANAV effectively prevented the quartermaster from marking navigation hazards for 2 hours prior to grounding. That goes back to where right after 4 o'clock, he told him to remove that, hazards overlay. You remember that? That's what that refers to. The ANAV made a lot of mistakes, and the quartermaster did too. And so this is really a failure, if you look at this, from the top and from the bottom coming together. The squadron, the submarine development squadron commander tried 3 times to inform those above him, ComSub PAC and CTF-74, that there were issues, and they shut him down because he's getting ready to get relieved anyway. And they authorized this to go to sea. And then from the bottom, from the deck plate level where I lived, the quartermaster, and especially the ANAV, who is an enlisted man, by the way, but he's senior enlisted and specially qualified to be an ANAV, really failed to perform their duties by simply informing people that there were no soundings for hours, which is insane. Like, the moment that happens, you inform people. You don't wait. Okay, the quartermaster was updating temporary routes instead of operating the fathometer. So because they had to do these temporary routes to go around these navigation hazards, he wasn't paying as much attention to the fathometer as he's required to be. Failure to shift fathometer to shallow mode caused loss of sounding. So something that shocked me here is because the bottom was getting closer and closer to the bottom of the submarine, right? That gap is getting closer and closer. They were in deep mode on the fathometer, according to the report, and they never switched to shallow mode. And because of that, because they were in that wrong deep shallow mode, they would never see the bottom because it requires things. I can't get into it. Shoot. Okay, finally, he says, when the sounding did not check with chart, they didn't take further action, and I've beat that to death. So there you go. That's from the investigation. Aftermath. What happened? Boy, everybody got fired. That's what happened. All right, the captain gets fired. The XO gets fired. The navigator got fired. The engineer, who was the officer of the deck at the time, he got fired. The ANAV got fired. The quartermaster, he just went to captain's mast. They figured he could stay, I guess. There was no explanation given. This is just the results. And then finally, the COB. Remember, the COB is the senior enlisted man. He's responsible for the crew's performance and to communicate with the captain, the crew's needs and things like that. He also went to, or he did not go to NJP. He just had an administrative letter put in his record. He was administratively counseled, and then he was also relieved as the USS Connecticut, from the USS Connecticut. There is a footnote in the inspection, or investigation rather, that says that he's being verified or qualified to go back to the USS Connecticut as COB. I don't know at the time of this recording if that happened or not, but that is one of the processes that they were going to do with the COB, is just reevaluate him because he's not part of any of the NJPs. He didn't violate the UCMJ. So maybe he could go back to the COB. If anyone knows, I know some people from the USS Connecticut watched my other videos about this story. If you guys know what happened to the COB, I would like to know, because he's a senior chief sonarman who I think I know. I knew him in my case as a junior sailor, and he ended up being the COB of the Connecticut. Anyway, so final thoughts. All right, so here's my 2 cents. This failure of command at command levels and navigation levels. Yeah, I would love to say it's a failure of all levels, but it's not, because the chief of the watch and the dive team, not the navigation team, but the ship's control party, that's what I'm trying to say, did the right actions. They saved the ship. Because the machinery watch was attentive and put that fire out right away by isolating the electrical bus to the number 2 trim pump. He did the right thing and saved the ship too, because the people covered in oil in the engine room after the collision realized that they still had a propulsion system that worked, and the oil that they had on them was cooking oil, not lubricating oil for the engines. Because they restored propulsion as quickly as they did, that definitely saved the ship. So a lot of people did the right things, guys, but the people who did not do is the command structure itself, and especially the navigation teams. They just did not, according to this investigation, they did not do their jobs. The inability to self-critique, change, and improve goes back to training and getting better. They definitely suffered from overconfidence. And like I said, I've seen this myself in programs where you have an elite force. Inside the submarine force considers itself an elite force. I think maybe all forces kind of do that to an extent. But whenever it comes to SSGNs and any kind of development squadron, like the Seawolf Squadron, you know, CSDS 5, you know, out on the West Coast, they really think just because they get assigned to that boat, the enlisted anyway, that they're special, that they got those orders because they're better than everybody else. Can be the mentality of a lot of sailors. It's not every one of them, of course. But I've seen it myself, so don't argue with me that it doesn't happen, because it does. Anyway, that overconfidence led to their inability to recognize key indicators that the ship was in danger. Yeah, that's called hubris at that point. Construction of standards saved the vessel. Immediate action saved the crew. And it could have been much worse. We could have lost the ship, we could have lost the crew, and we almost did. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. I really appreciate this. This has been the USS Connecticut final investigation report as declassified by the Navy, fully redacted. Please leave a comment and a like, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a great one, everybody. Bye.